Now I'm going to have the happy opportunity of handing over to the convener here in a second, but before they leap into action, or too many women, it's wrong, sexist. No, I'm joking. Tonight, distinguished female panel, who we mustn't say such a thing, there's gender naughty specific. Okay. I want to thank all the sponsors, because this is really quite important for STM. Ares, Atipon, Crossref, Hindawi, and MPS, all of whom are present, I think. Yes, except Crossref. Yes, oh, hello, Miss Crossref, hello. Yes, we are very grateful. I know I can speak on behalf of STM. Secondly, those of you who haven't looked at the program for tomorrow, which I happen to have organized on Beyond Open Access, it's called, it's not a typical open access seminar. And if you look at it, somebody might feel tempted to register for tomorrow as well, or even tell your colleagues back home in the next break that they should really come. Just a thought. Anyhow, I now hand over to Tasha.
So, is this working? Yes? No? Okay. When I started thinking about putting today together, I started thinking about production workflow systems. And I don't know about the rest of you, but when I started as a production editor, we used strip charts to track production. And then we had this radical innovation, which was Excel spreadsheets, which were massive improvements on strip charts, but really not very user-friendly in terms of automating the production process or even giving us any kind of backup if somebody missed a stage by mistake. Eventually, I encountered Biomed Central's custom-built in-house workflow system for production tracking. And obviously, I know that a number of the peer review systems also incorporate production tracking workflows into the back end. It's always struck me as somewhat surprising that there aren't really any production-first commercial workflow tracking systems. It does tend to be somewhat of an afterthought, and I know that Mark from Ares and I have had this discussion a couple of times, and I know he doesn't agree with me, but it still feels to me that with the peer review systems, production is often an afterthought. So when I joined IOP and discovered that we were in the middle of a production workflow rebuild, I was very keen to go out and look for a new commercial system, if such a thing existed. And we discovered that there was a thing called MPS Track, which had originally been built in collaboration between MPS and Maney. So we went down the route of investigating that, and we're in the middle of implementing it at the moment. So joining me on the panel, we have Sam from Maney, who is the brains behind MPS Track, for which I'm extremely grateful. We have Janine from Emerald, who also has implemented MPS Track for a very different kind of publisher. So we've got three quite radically different publishers here at the moment. And I've also got, right at the far end, Sue from IOP, who's been responsible for actually leading the implementation project. So I'm going to hand over.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Just that. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Very briefly about Maney Publishing, because I'm sure some of you know us, but many of you probably won't. Maney's a small to medium-sized publisher. Next year we'll be publishing over 170 journals, 660 issues, and about 7,000 articles. We really are quite even in our balance of subject areas. We publish actually more humanities and social sciences, but our STM list is growing fast and is probably about 45% now of what we publish. So, as Tasha said, we developed the first iteration of Maney Track back in 2011 with Macmillan Publishing Solutions. We started the sourcing process for the system in 2010. We had a short list, we sent out RFPs to about 10 different companies and we shortlisted to 3. At that time, I think there was even less available on the market in terms of production tracking systems, and things have certainly moved on in the last couple of years, I'd say. So why did Mainey want a tracking system? Well, we've grown rapidly, and in 2010, we were still using the wonderful Excel spreadsheets that Tasha mentioned to track everything we were doing with all these issues and all these articles through production. Our staff overheads were going up directly in relation to pretty much every journal we acquired. Skilled staff were spending a lot of time on manual data entry, some of that for things that were already for the STM part of our list in, for example, Editorial Manager, which is our peer review system. Then production staff were actually transferring all this over to Excel spreadsheets and tracking every part of the process manually. There was also what we call the black tunnel syndrome, where, say, for STM authors, the peer review process had been very transparent for them. But then once their paper was accepted and came into production, they didn't know anything until they got a proof. They then didn't know anything until their article was published. So the workflow for them as such was not at all transparent. So there were many good reasons why we started to look for a production tracking system. So we selected, our iteration is called Mainey Track, but MPS Track, as I said, after a thorough review process. Because we had a hand in developing it, really that's why we chose to go with MPS. To be honest, the pricing was competitive and we felt that MPS would be good partners for us and that we could work well with them. In terms of, Tasha asked us for our negative experiences, maybe I say learning experiences rather than negative. There were the inevitable frustrations. I'm being totally honest with you, I think we went live too early. So we went live with bugs that were already in the system, and then with live running, that was bugs on bugs on bugs. So it took a while for us to iron those out. Lots of positives. As I said, the previously manual tasks were now automated, allowing production staff to spend much more time on the content itself, on essentially customer service with our authors and our academic editors. Greater transparency for everyone involved in the process in terms of authors who can now log into this system and see where their papers were in the production process. Academic editors could do the same. And of course, everyone in-house had greater transparency, greater reporting for the production processes. So I'll give you some hard figures now. So between 2011 and earlier this year, the issues that we were to publish has gone up by 53%. As I said, we've had quite phenomenal growth, really. But the cost of producing an issue for us has actually gone down by 16% using this system. In the same way, pages to be published has gone up by 66% in that time, but the average cost per page of producing an issue has gone down by 23%. So it really has been quite a success for us. Staffing hasn't gone up dramatically either. Back in April 2011, we had 8 full-time production staff working just on journals. We now have 10, which in terms of the growth Mainey's had, I think is a positive outcome. So in terms of key tips and learning points, I think we could all say, or we said at the start, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a production tracking system? But there's wouldn't it be nice versus the realities of it. So I think you have to, it sounds simplistic, but you have to really keep in mind exactly what it is you want this to achieve. I think like Jim was saying earlier, you have to know your workflows as they are now. Don't build a system around old workflows. Really look at what you've got now and what you want to achieve. When we actually laid out our workflows, and I said to Sue earlier, it looked like a sort of power station type diagram with everything that was going everywhere. I'd say be very generous with in-house time that you allow for the integration of the system. Testing and more testing is really, really important. Allow enough time for that. I hate the term, but you really do have to get buy-in as well from internal and external stakeholders. People can get scared of systems, something new, a change. That was really important for us to make sure we were sort of selling the system to staff and other stakeholders up front so they knew the benefits. I definitely say allow money in the return on investment for developments each year, as we've seen, and certainly in terms of things, as eLife are doing. Workflows are changing all the time. The requirements of the industry are changing all the time. Allow money to develop your system alongside that. And don't go live unless you're entirely happy with it. If there's a deadline, yes, you don't want project creep, but at the same time, you want to be live knowing that you've thoroughly tested it. That's it.
Thank you very much, Sam. Interesting that you mentioned the power station diagram of workflows. It's quite a familiar concept. Janine, I pass it over to you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, hello everyone to begin with. Let me tell you a little bit about Emerald first of all. Emerald is a publisher based in the north of England, so maybe not everyone in the room is familiar with us, but we are a medium-sized publisher of business and management titles primarily. We have some engineering titles, some economics, but it's primarily management business. Our list is around 250 journals per year, and we also have a books front list of around 160 titles a year, and that's growing at a fairly rapid rate. And when we started looking at a tracking system, I had only just arrived at Emerald, so I arrived at Emerald at the beginning of 2012. So when I arrived, familiar with much of what Sam has said, we also had a production department that was used to having lots of new work and lots of new heads. It was becoming extremely costly, and we were running a lot of the tracking on spreadsheets, which wasn't sustainable for the foreseeable. So it became clear from the beginning that we were going to have to start looking at a tracking system. So our timeline was that we did a lot of research in 2012. When I had first arrived, looked at lots of different systems out there. We put out the RFP in October. We made a decision in November, and we signed the contract in December. Now, I'm slightly different from Sam in the going live once the testing's finished, because we had a very, very tight deadline. We went live on the 1st of July in 2013, so it took us 6 months from selection to configuration and embedding and going live. And that was no small feat, but we did have a new platform coming right towards us at the end of 2013, and I was very clear that if I didn't get that live, I was going to lose the resource that I needed from IT and business technology to support me in the move. It was very much a cross-functional rollout across Emerald, and I needed their help. So when I looked at the system, I had a wish list of what I wanted, and I wanted it to be a system that could cover an article and an issue-based workflow. I wanted it to cover all of my content, so books and journals and our case study content, so issue-based workflow and article-based, and also take a metadata feed from ScholarOne. I wanted reporting because the spreadsheets that I was dealing with in my new team were driving me mad, and it was taking ages to get the reporting that I needed from a team on a list of titles I wasn't that familiar with. The reporting was a huge deal for me, and it needed to be fairly intuitive to use. Echoing Sam's point on the buy-in, I knew I was going to have to get all of my team working on these 3 different products onto a tracking system quite quickly, and it was going to have to embed and stick quite fast because we had other big projects coming along. So we spent a lot of time trying to get buy-in, both in the mapping and in the embedding afterwards. We did look again at lots of systems. We looked at probably about 8 or 10 when we went out to RFP on. We selected 3 for a short list. We demoed them, and then we scored them all, and actually the one we picked was a unanimous winner from the scores of business technology, information technology, and my own department, so that was a bonus. I think the things I would take as learning points from it is that we did do it very quickly, and in the end, the main driver for me had been business reporting. Echoing the comments about the bugs, we focused on fixing any bugs to go live as quickly as we could, but at the last minute I stripped out the reporting module so that we could go live. I took the mindset that there was no data in there anyway, so I wasn't going to report on anything in the beginning, so it was better to get us on the system and moving, and we turned on the reporting later, so we have got that now, but I do think the reporting is an issue. We made the choices we made mainly because we had focused a lot on the roadmaps of both companies. We looked at the partnership. We looked at the development options. I like the tracking system that we picked. We have added on to what Sam had, and we've branded ours as Track It. But I like the fact it's very intuitive. It looks and feels very much like the Maney system, and it's easy to use, but there is the opportunity to add on extra functionality and extra services around that now that we're up and running. And I think echoing a lot of what Sam says, I think one size doesn't fit all for a tracking system, but the one we have has got the nuts and bolts you need to add on to it. I can't give the specifics on how much we have improved our operational capabilities in the way that Sam did, because we've had lots of other moving goalposts in the 18-month window. So we've got lots of new products, we've got lots of new journals, we have more content, but we've also moved vendors and had some restructuring. So it's not just a black and white equation I can give. But what I can say is that the mapping of all of the workflows we did prior to embedding our tracking system and building it in the way that I wanted it reduced the schedules from anything up to 30 weeks down to a standard 8 to 10 week turnaround. So I'm happy with the speed we're moving at now, and it's completely transparent. That might be one of the issues that helps or hinders the embedding in the team when you're moving from spreadsheets, but at least we can see where everything is now and report metrics on it. And that was pretty much everything I had to say about it.
Well, I hope you have a little more to say about it for the Q&A session. Now, the reason that I say IOP is somewhat different is that we only have 75 titles, but we do publish 30,000 articles every year. We have production teams in 2 continents, and we have recently introduced a books program for the first time in about a decade, so that's been interesting as well. We haven't quite finished and gone live with our implementation of MPS Track. But we did start from a very different base point.
Indeed. Let me just check. Is this working? Okay. Is that any better? Yes. Okay. Yes, as Tasha says, I'm slightly here under false pretenses because we're not actually using the system yet, but we're well on the way with our build and implementation planning. So our version of MPS Track will be called Proton. We'll be using it for our books and our journals, and we expect to be using it from early next year and are planning a phased implementation over about 6 months altogether to move all of our products across. What we've got at the moment that's different from these guys is a fairly sophisticated tracking system that also does content management for us. And that was designed in-house and built very much to suit our workflows for maximum staff efficiency so that our staff can focus on the value-added parts of the process and not doing the routine bits. We let the system do that. Now, our current system is 15 years old, which, as somebody pointed out earlier, is a very, very old for a system. So it's well overdue for replacement. It's served us well, but it definitely was time for a change. So that's why we went to look for something different. Also, our current system doesn't handle the new books program, and we were looking for a few other improvements, such as better freelance management and better reporting. So the reason we chose this system was it seemed to offer the necessary flexibility for us. We considered various different options for replacements, including obviously another in-house build, but in the end decided that this was going to work better for us. But our drivers were different because we already had a very efficient process. We needed to make sure that we didn't go backwards with anything. And our in-house system is designed for our article-based workflow. We found that many of the off-the-shelf systems out there were mainly focusing on issue-based publication, which wouldn't have worked for us. We've also got a number of other systems, internal and external, integrated with our current system in ways that suit us, but perhaps wouldn't suit anyone else. So we needed to make sure that our new system would be able to replicate that as well. At the moment, obviously, our experience of actually using the system is non-existent, but we've got good experience of working with MPS during the build process. So we're very impressed with that. They're working hard for us. We've got lots of new features coming all of the time, and we're finding that they're quite open to taking on ideas from us as well as adapting them slightly to improve upon them in some cases. And obviously an additional benefit coming from an in-house system is that we get to share experiences with guys like this, which for me is nice, because otherwise it's quite a sort of isolated process looking after our system. Key learning points really from the implementation end of things. Don't think of this as a configuration project if you've taken on off-the-shelf systems before. It's much more in-depth than that. And you will be delving into areas that take quite a lot of detailed knowledge and also a lot more time than you're probably expecting. So extend your schedule accordingly. Ideally, this is fairly obvious, but ideally review your workflows before you start building the new system, not in the middle of the process. But then that's not always possible. Try and standardise as much as possible. Obviously, again, fairly obvious, but the more variations you have, the more complexity you'll be adding and the more documentation you'll need to keep track of everything. Ask the people who will actually be using the system what they really do, not what everybody thinks they should be doing, and get them involved with the design of the system right from the start, and also with the testing. That'll help with having a better system at the end of it, but I think it'll also help with overcoming the resistance to change that everybody has. So if you've got users who are saying, yes, I've helped design this and I think it's going to work, then their colleagues will be quite likely to listen to that from them when they wouldn't listen to it from somebody who doesn't do the job. Also, be clear which of your requirements are non-negotiable and which ones you might be prepared to compromise on, and try and make that very clear to your development team, because otherwise you'll find they're building marvellous little features that were just a passing thought. And also remember that the system isn't necessarily the answer to everything. There may be some parts of your process that are actually better handled manually still, even with a spreadsheet possibly, if they're very peculiar to one or two journals. So it's not always the answer to automate things. I think that's it from me.
Thank you very much to all three of you. All of you picked up on workflow standardisation, and it's very easy to say workflow standardisation, but I'm sure you've all experienced some challenges around that. Could you maybe share with us how you've found tactics to encourage your teams to really buy into, sorry, Sam, I know you don't like that phrase, to buy into these standardised workflows? Start with Janine, because I know you went through a very complex process with that.
Yeah, we went through a very complex process, largely because we were moving from something that had evolved in spreadsheets over a period of years into something that was going to be much more standard. So, and the added complexity was I was quite new to the company, so was bringing a lot of change to a department that was quite stable and hadn't had a lot of change for a while. So there was some cultural resistance there. We spent a massive amount of time prior to engaging in the scoping of our actual workflow with MPS, with the in-house teams. It was Friday afternoon workshops. Old school, with brown paper on the walls and post-it notes, and we literally had our teams mapping what they were doing, and then lots of asking questions, and it went, it was weeks and weeks and weeks of workshops. What we did do is we significantly reduced the numbers of stages, but the mark of success for us was that when we finally got to the point they were questioning their own workflows and asking questions, or using the red marker pen to score out things that they were seeing themselves or weren't required, that was when we felt we were ready to finally pass it on to MPS. There had been a real drift over the years of every time there'd been a problem, something else had been added on the end and added on the end and added on the end, and the workflow just seemed to go on forever. So it was a real push to get the right stages in at the top of the process so that we were clear where we were going, but that we had got it right from the beginning so we could minimise the stages. So it has been very effective, and it is something we would have probably done anyway because I was new and I was still figuring out what was going on. It has enabled us to streamline our workflows because our content enables us to maybe 2 or 3 different workflows, but our schedules are much shorter. So it was a needed exercise, but it gave it a bit of push and focus, and the tracking system that they wanted couldn't come until they'd done it.
So how are you going to ensure that you don't drift again, what kind of control mechanisms are you putting in place?
All the reporting. We have now got an ability, there's a lot more visibility around publication times. Our tracking system, one of my other wish list items that I don't think I really fully expanded on was that I wanted it to cover the whole breadth of content management. So not only did I want it to cover my books and journals and case studies in an article-based and issue-based workflow, but I also wanted it to cover my editorial and production departments. So the fact that it gives me a breadth of reporting from start to finish of the entire process means that we're much tighter on our metrics and our ability to manage our time to publication than we had previously. So even for stages that were in-house, we have turnaround times that are very comparable to those we have at vendors, so that we're able to monitor exactly when things are coming in and when they're going out. We've also been able to use it upstream with our editor training, because we can see how many issues come in late to us as content management, how many we publish late, and there's a big difference. And those numbers are able to be fed back upstream to the editors to get them to commit to their timely publication as well.
So, Sam, what about your experiences with narrowing down the workflow field?
Well, we'd started work on that really at least 2 years before we even decided we were going to look at a tracking system. So we had quite a good run-up really. It was really important for me to sort of get the ducks in order in the department before we did anything like that. So we did take a long time looking at our processes, hopefully knocking out the inefficiencies where we could, like Janine said, reducing some of the stages in the process, if you like, that just were perhaps once necessary but weren't anymore. And again, very much like Janine said, getting everyone in the department involved in that, having workshops, discussions about we do this now, how could we do it better, not only helped with the actual process, but again, got everyone involved with the system. So it really is a sort of big sit down, draw out diagrams, and go through everything and try not to just fall into old habits, because that's very easily done. We know how we do it now, so that's how we're going to stay doing it, to sort of try and expand your mind a bit.
So thank you very much. I'd now like to open the floor up for questions. I think Joe is at the back with some
questions.
microphones.
I have a question to start things off. I was thinking about the position of content management production in the bigger picture of all the processes that go on in a publishing house. And it occurs to me, of course, that anything you do with new systems are going to affect other people, both ends, marketing, and of course, as well as editorial, but also the outside world who you're so dependent on. And how, and several of you mentioned timing constraints or resource constraints, like IT, for example. How did you get the buy-in from the management board of the company? How did you do that, and did you get what you wanted? Any of you, including you, Tasha?
I'm staying out of this.
Okay.
I'll leave that one to Sue and Sam and Janine.
Yes, we got, I think it is difficult. We did get IT resource, and that was budgeted and time-sheeted very carefully, so we knew exactly what time was being spent there. Business resource is not time-sheeted in the same way, which has good points and bad points. We did make sure that we had some production staff, as I said, who were moved across or seconded onto the project team, which was extremely valuable, and there was an expectation that this was a high priority project for us, so other people were able to put their time into it, but I think it always takes more time than you've allowed. It's not a trivial task at all.
Do others agree?
Yeah.
Because I've always done this from when I was in charge of a production department. I was always a board member, unusually so, because I was a publishing director. So I didn't have this problem. I used to beat up the people and force them. Sorry, it's what's called engagement. Now, questions? Yes.
Hi, Tracy Head from Cabby. I was just wondering if you find there's such a thing as too much transparency. So if an author can log in to the system and perhaps see that their article or the book hasn't moved on as quickly as they'd like, does that cause problems?
I wouldn't say it causes problems. I'd say, yes, we do get questions sometimes. The system says my article is due to be online here. Why isn't it? But actually, I'd say the number of queries, you balance out the number of queries about what's happening with my article, when am I getting my proofs, when is it being published, have obviously greatly lessened because authors can now enter the system and see that themselves. So there really is a balance there, and it's tipped on the side of a positive in positive.
Anybody else? Anything? I wonder if Melissa. I mean, this is one of the big problems. It seems you are in an unusual position where the researchers have told you directly what they want. They want transparency, don't they? Yeah, they say that, and they actually do. They actually do want transparency. I mean, I know as an author, and my wife is a scientist, so they want transparency. Yeah, even if it's bad and the nasty things come up, they'd rather know.
Well, like I said, if they've been reviewed and accepted via a peer review system, which the majority will have been, they have all that transparency. And then what happens once it's accepted? Where's my paper gone? Into a black hole? So it's extremely important now for authors to know exactly what's happening throughout the process, or the key points for them throughout the process.
Got a question there? No?
I am wondering if any of you looked at the R-Suite product, and if you did, during your due diligence, if you have anything that you can say about that.
Which product was this? Sorry.
It's R-Suite. They have a workflow, production workflow tracking system.
We did.
As part of their offering.
Briefly, it wasn't one that we investigated in as much detail as some of the other systems out there. I honestly can't remember exactly why we turned that one down.
I can fill in a little on that one. When we investigated the R-Suite product, it was felt that it would have been more suited to magazines and web-based products. It's not, or it certainly wasn't at the time that we investigated it, it was not particularly suited to academic journals and academic books, particularly in the sense that we were using offshore vendors to supply the XML, to supply the PDF. And while R-Suite was very well suited to a journalistic type of workflow resulting in, for example, our Physics World product, it wasn't quite what we were looking for in terms of production or journals production.
And more questions. I wonder, just before you speak, John, I want to say MPS people are here, I know, and there's two people who have mentioned MPS. They might think about whether they want to ask a question or be asked a question about their feelings about the negotiation that went on with these companies. It's just a good opportunity. John Haynes, anyhow. So.
Yeah, hi. Hi, from AIP Publishing. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks to the panel. Very interesting discussion. In terms of authors and transparency, and authors being the customer, and trying to provide that seamless journey for them through the submission, through the publication process, did you ever give some wild thoughts to just having one content management system rather than two, and siloing it, one in author tracking editorial office stuff and one doing the production stuff? Did you ever kind of think that madly? I don't know.
Well, actually, that's what we've got at the moment. That's what we're moving away from.
Okay.
Not because of the authors at all. It was just too complex to maintain that and develop. That's what our old existing system did, peer review and production. But the challenges of developing all of the ends of it to keep up with all of the new industry requirements were just too much to make that our core business. We've taken a slightly different approach with authors during the production process, not to sort of dismiss what Sam was saying. They can log into our current system, authors, and see where their article is after acceptance. Initially, at least, we're not planning for them to log into the new system when we move to that. We've taken the view that we'll be publishing things so fast that they'll hardly have time to worry about where it's got to. They can log into the peer review system, which tends to move much slower, and track it then. But once it has been accepted, we weighed up the pros and cons of them having visibility versus them having to remember lots of different passwords, and decided that perhaps it was simpler not to go there. So we shall see.
Any other comments? This is very interesting to those of us who are not directly involved, because, I mean, like John, this has been a holy grail for me in the past. And, no?
I think it's quite interesting that Sam mentioned that Mania are using as Editorial Manager as the peer review system. So actually maybe you could talk us through why you didn't choose, I think, is it Preprint Manager, Richard? Is that the correct term? Preprint Manager?
Do you want to say anything, Richard? It's an interesting, I know you're interested in this because we've discussed this in the past. So can you get hold of that man? Yes.
Hi, this is Richard Wynn from Aries Systems. We make available the Editorial Manager peer review system that's used by Mani, but also a production tracking module that's called Production Manager. It's used by several of our customers. So, for example, Wolters Kluwer transitioned 300 journals from an in-house production tracking system to Production Manager last year over 6 months. And Wiley VCH runs Editorial Manager and Production Manager in parallel. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing more and more people using the workflow end-to-end like that is that you've got more standards that need to be integrated the whole way. Things like ORCID, FundRef, institutional identifiers, the single sign-on issue, all of those things speak to needing a good overlap between the systems. Our system is also a full content management system. It's not just tracking the metadata, excuse me, it's also the files itself. And you want those files to flow through. And looking over the horizon, you want XML native editing in the system from editorials through to production. So I think that's why there is more and more of a tendency to see this as a fully integrated end-to-end solution. Sorry for the pitch. But
Any comments?
I would like to hear from Sam about why the counter decision was taken.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously we were looking at the tracking system in 2010, and in terms of systems, that's quite a long time ago actually. The Editorial Manager, or Aries version, was in our top 3, but we decided to go with our own version, and my experience is quite different from Janine's and Sue's because we did build it from scratch according to our requirements. And Production Manager had definitely had a lot to offer, but we wanted something that really closely matched exactly what we wanted. For example, I don't know what Production Manager has now, but we also wanted an e-commerce facility for things like processing off-print, open access, and printed colour payments. So we felt that we just had more requirements than at the time the other systems in the process could offer us, really. And the thing is, Editorial Manager and our systems talk to each other. So essentially, the XML comes from the Editorial Manager system and is then fed into our tracking system. So the two do speak to each other quite well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that I would agree.
Is that it? I might just need to pull it.
Is it on? Yeah.
There we are. I would agree. I think that the 2 years since we made a selection, things have moved on. But one of the things that I've found most useful about our tracking system and the decisions we made is that what we had at Go Live is not what we have now. So we're working quite closely with our vendor partners at the various items on their roadmap and on my own roadmap, so that as I'm ready to take things on stream, I can do that. So obviously I've referenced already, we started our business reporting after we went live, and we are also looking at other areas around that. So the full content management system, rather than just tracking, We have got the feed of metadata from Scholar One for our peer-reviewed content, but we also have our books and track it as well as our journals. So we are constantly looking at how we can add on or improve or innovate in our system. We basically went for the sort of basic model 2 years ago because that fitted our need as we made some other changes around the department. But I think it is fair to say 2 years is a long time. So what I have now and what I have 12 months from now will be very different to what I went live with 18 months ago.
And a question over there. I'll go over this one. I'll do the running now, Joe. You can relax for a moment.
I don't really have a question, just from MPS, and just wanted to weigh in. We obviously have been, through all 3 implementations, and I think what's been common is there's through all these implementations, there are 2 sides. One side is the technology side, and the other side is the people side. On the technology side, we were fairly confident going into each of these implementations that we had a core system that was intuitive and smart. And on top of that, we had a very flexible and responsive development team that would adapt the system to the unique publisher requirements. So, we were very confident on the technology side. The second side, I think, which is somewhat understated, is the people side, which I think in all the 3 cases here, one of the most underlying important things was that in each of these 3 cases, we had a very passionate project champion at the publisher side, who is in fact not just a project champion, but a change agent, because this is a tremendous amount of change that an organization needs to go through, from working from a very manual-based workflow to going through a system-based workflow. So I think what's really, from a vendor perspective, we can deliver technology and solutions, but for them to truly become powerful, you need user acceptance, and that can only happen when you have a very passionate project champion or a change agent at the publisher side, and we've been fortunate enough to have them in each of these 3 implementations.
Thank you, that was interesting. Now, some more comments, questions.
Just to interrupt
okay,
very
you're going
briefly.
to say it.
One of the things that we did at IOP was put in what we've called transition coordinators. So they are members of the production team, frontline production staff, who are coordinating and working very closely with Sue on testing MPS Track, or Proton as it's going to be known, to the nth degree. And also getting very engaged with it, and they are acting as champions for the system around the rest of the team. So it's not being imposed by management or by IT. It's a system that production colleagues are actually working on and are engaging with. So I was wondering if Sam and Janine had followed a similar kind of process.
Hi, yeah, we did both when we were rolling it out, and one of the most successful things we have implemented in the last 18 months has been the super users. So we have got members of editorial, rights management who have a stake in the system, although they don't use it daily, and production working as our super users, and they're really the experts. So they have gone from having no knowledge to being the main contact, both with MPS and within the department, for any training or upgrading or changes that we've made to the system. And we have made quite a few changes as we've gone along, as new products have come on stream. So most of that has moved from the managers of the department into the team itself.
Pretty similar, although I still think maybe because it was partly me who, I'd say, built it from scratch, I probably still have more involvement with it. But yeah, the team are very involved with it, and we're actually looking at developments for it at the moment, and we've just gone through a whole review process which hasn't only included production but also members of all the other departments in the company. So again, just getting people involved is very important. Things have changed, there are now more needs, so we hope for a successful review process.
Sorry, Kaveh.
John mentioned the holy grail of having basically less systems going from end to end. I've been thinking about this, and one thing that would really make a big difference is if authors, most things are Word or some tech. But if authors had the choice at least to write online in a system, that would really change the whole thing. That means you have your content in the system, in the cloud, and everything else can flow very, very smoothly from there. For example, you'd have a copy editor would edit online. Peer review would simply be another role, would go online, do the peer review. We get rid of the model of attachments that we have now. We have Word files going back and forth, content, PDF files. And I think if we can have systems, there are systems, we've got a system, other people write LaTeX, Authoria, these sort of people, it would really simplify the whole process and speed up and reduce costs.
So
Comment.
I'm going to take this one. I absolutely agree that if we could encourage authors to make use of the technologies out there to author in the cloud, that would make significant differences to the ease of peer review and production. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you are, that is a massive cultural change across a very, very large number of people, and I just don't think it's going to happen quickly. I think it will happen, but it's going to take a couple of research generations before it's widespread. I don't know if the rest of you would agree.
Them first and then Bill. You're not going to say anything to that incredibly daring remark by
Natasha. It would be great if we ended up in that position. I expect I'll have retired by the time that happens. So, yeah, it's great to aim for, but I think it's a long way off.
I think it would also depend on the subject field,
Yes.
and I will probably be at the tail end of that, so it definitely won't be in my lifetime.
And I think there's always going to be some authors who don't conform anyway for whatever reason. So,
realistically, we've implemented Scholar One for peer review, and Biomed Central going back a few years. Biomed Central was born digital. It was born with a workflow system that authors could submit in, and we would still get people sending us things in the post or by email that they wanted to have us submit on their behalf to the workflow system.
2001, wasn't it?
It was 2001, the workflow system was up and running, and I left in 2013, and on my last day at Biomed Central, we got something in the post with a CD saying, please submit this for me.
Bill.
First of all, I absolutely agree that it's a massive cultural change to get authors to just use disciplined systems like that. But I suggest that one way to make progress in that direction is to just give authors access incrementally at different points of the workflow. So, for example, let them submit all their figures to a system that tells them if their figures are okay or not, and tells them how to fix the figures if they need to be fixed. Give them their proofs in a way that instead of just communicating changes, they can actually make changes. You know, give them, once you've got it in the XML, maybe they didn't give you XML to start with, but once you've got it in the XML, then give them access so that when they're putting changes in, they're fixing things in the references, they can actually do it to the XML rather than giving you something that you then have to do the work on and check and give a proof back to them on.
That's our next consideration, actually, because currently ManyTrack is only tracking of metadata, dates, etc. So that is exactly what we're looking at now, full content management, but also with a digital editing interface. So the tracking is linked to the editing, is linked to the proofing, and I think many vendors or typesetters as well are actually starting to offer that. Which is only a good thing, and you're right, and the corrections are made directly into the XML, which is certainly something we're looking into now.
yeah, that's how our version of the system will be going live, full content management and editing built in. But that will be editing by the production staff and our freelance editors and proofreaders. We've talked about letting authors loose to make changes directly, and it is on the plan, but not yet. No, it's definitely theoretically possible and theoretically very desirable. I think we're all going to be a bit nervous about actually letting them loose.
And I think the easiest way to get it to happen is to just select the bits that
Yes.
are most useful for them to be able to touch,
Yeah.
and at least get them to do that little piece and that little piece,
Yeah,
etc.
and I
You'll
definitely
get
agree.
things to move in the right direction.
Yes,
and in
start
the meantime,
at-
they're doing more of the work for you, which is a benefit too.
Yeah, and if you start at the end of the process where the article has definitely been accepted and is going to be published, that makes a lot more sense than, you know, the rejection rates are still quite high at the submission end of things.
With the editing systems that are out there, I mean, already, of course, that you have permissions about what the authors can and cannot touch. So if you don't want them moving figures, you set that they can't move the figures. So, I mean, that's already happening, which, again, is only a good thing, I think.
Yeah. The fundamental problem with getting them to author your way in the first place is that they've authored it before they submit it to you for a publication. So the horse is out of the barn by then. That's a fundamental problem.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on that. I think it's great that there are more and more authoring tools and collaboration tools coming out, like Write LaTeX and others. And I think it is going to happen. And it doesn't need to be a big disruption because most of those tools can generate some form of JATS, XML, and some of them are now embedding standards like ORCID. So that what it means is that submission systems like ours, and I assume others, have services where with one-click submit, you can transfer a manuscript from those authoring tools into peer review tools. So you don't have to think of it as authoring within the peer review system. You can let 1,000 flowers bloom. You know, let every specialty have its own authoring system that's specialized for economics or chemistry or whatever, but then have essentially a web service to transfer into editorial and then production systems.
I have a question which is about books and journals. All of you do books and journals, or book-shaped things, which are E only. The systems you're discussing handle books and journals. Does this cause a problem for either books or journals? Or, I mean, is it easy to put books into what is, I think, essentially a journal system with books in it, yeah?
We built separate tabs because the in-house team are a fairly small number of people and they work on books and journals. We don't have named specific production editors in the way that I was used to in other locations or other companies. So I didn't want them to be too different. So what we have done is we have very similar interfaces. The stages are primarily different before it reaches editorial or production, and then the same from that moment it comes into us and throughout the system. And we went to great lengths to name all the stages the same things and to give some sort of harmony on what we were doing. There are some differences at the beginning, because obviously we're not taking a feed from Scholar One, and we do use our Trackit metadata for our Onward ATI feeds. So there were some additional changes at the beginning to get the content information into us through editorial assistance rather than a feed from Scholar One, and there's some difference with what we do with the metadata at the end. But for the core production stages, they're more similar than they are different. The problems we had in-house were the teams understanding them to be the same thing or believing them to be different when they weren't. So for the most part, it works. We did do some finessing around the edges, but it's probably about 90% the same. We have got standalones, book series and serials in there, and we will be doing more of that going forward. So I will need to make some more changes, but ultimately it gives me all of my content reportable from one source.
Can I just follow up on that? Mm-hmm. I'm at the moment doing a chapter in a book by, let us say, a large university press, and when I look at the way they're handling it, I'm just amazed it's still much the same as it was in the 1970s when I used to really work with books a lot. It seems to me, anyhow. It'll change soon, I'm sure. However, are book authors rather surprised when they find out the way you're doing things? Or are they just treated as, it must be different from what some other publishers are doing.
For me, I wouldn't say that they're that surprised. I mean, a lot of our content, our book authors are commissioned content, and they tend to be editors that are familiar with us from our journals programme anyway. Most of the contact with the authors would happen upstream of us before it gets into the content management system. But for the most part, we haven't had that feedback. We are making quite a lot of changes to how we do our books in the next 12 to 18 months, so there might be some positive feedback then, but we're not hearing any complaints. But it is very much the same as it's always been. It's very static.
Yeah.
So, I was going to say, we've implemented, we've introduced ebooks, which are printed, which is hilarious. We have introduced ebooks at IOP after a hiatus of a number of years, and the workflow for producing books is the same as the workflow for producing journals. What we have had to do is configure quite a significant number of additional metadata fields within the Proton system. So that's the only really significant difference. We aren't yet on Proton for books, but we have had feedback already from a number of authors saying that they're surprised by how quickly we are producing their books. I think since we implemented the journal-style production system in May, we've averaged 7.5 weeks within the production team, and then a few weeks additional on top with the authors. So we're turning books around much more quickly than we would have been able to in an old-fashioned books production way.
We have a really small list of books, and it's not something really we're particularly looking to grow, so we haven't actually got that part of the system. We didn't develop that. But what I would say, I think I just heard you mention it, is one of the biggest issues, if you like, is getting the metadata into the system. So the comparison I can give is that many of our humanities journals don't go through a peer review system. We're trying to push them that way, but it's slower moving than the STM side of things. So getting the metadata into the system has been a real challenge for us, and it's very much still a manual entry. So I just think, I'm not saying a system shouldn't deal with books, but that's something to be aware of, I think.
Yeah. Anybody now? Nobody from OUP is here, are they? I wonder how they. Okay. Any more questions from anybody? I think we're nearly getting to. I'd like Tasha to finish off by saying something, because you're the boss. You go and say something about this.
He keeps telling me to say things. So, obviously, I am aware that there are other production tracking systems out there. I am aware that, for example, the Royal Society use Publishing at Work. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Kelly. There are systems out there that can help publishers to move beyond the spreadsheet. None of them are easy to implement. None of them are disruption-free. We chose, three of the publishers represented here chose MPS Track for one reason or another. Obviously, we think it's a great system. We're very pleased with what we've done. I take everybody's points about end-to-end peer review through production. It's a lovely utopia. It's not always the most practical. And I hope that you've taken some learning points away from the team on the panel about standardising your workflows and bringing your team along with you when you're thinking about implementing a system like this.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.